Welcome back to the Tavern, folks. Grab a drink, settle into your favorite seat, and lend me your ears because tonight we're going back to the fires that forged the early OSR. Last week we talked about the blogosphere. 1,000 little lanterns flickering across the hobby, each held by someone rediscovering the magic of old school play. It was raw, personal, and wonderfully chaotic. But something was missing. You see, blogs could spark ideas, but they couldn't temper them. For that, the OSR needed something louder, something messier, something that could survive the heat of argument, scrutiny, and decidedly passion. And so we turn to the forums, the great communal halls of the early OSR. This is where ideas weren't just shared, they were forged. In the mid 2000s, old school gamers were scattered. Some were lurking on 3rd edition boards, others were running house ruled campaigns in isolation, and many thought they were alone. Curious about BX or OD&D or even AD&D 1E, but unsure if anyone else still cared. Blogs cracked that shell, but forums? Forums are likely the ones that shattered it. Forums became the first real meeting places of the movement. They weren't polished, they weren't organized, but they were alive, buzzing with the kind of energy you only get when a community realizes it actually exists. Arguments broke out, entire rule sets were dissected line by line. Forgotten rulings were resurrected, and suddenly old school rules had a place to live, breathe, even battle for survival. This wasn't nostalgia. This wasn't remember when. This was a renaissance. So, to understand the early OSR, as you see up on the screen here, you have to understand Dragonsfoot. If the blogosphere was the back room of a pub, Dragonsfoot was the bonfire out front. Big, loud, impossible to ignore. And I do have a story for later. Here gathered the diehards, the AD&D keepers of the flame, the folks who could quote the DMG like scripture and weren't afraid to tell you why weapon speed mattered. Or didn't, depending on the thread. Dragonsfoot was where forgotten subsystems were excavated. Grognards debated initiative like medieval scholars. And the first whispers of, could we rebuild AD&D, actually began. You can draw a straight line from Dragonsfoot's endless AD&D postmortems to the birth of OSRIC, the first major Retroclone. Dragonsfoot wasn't just a forum, it was the anvil. But it's not the only one. If Dragonsfoot was the bonfire, Knights and Knaves Alehouse was the study. Quieter but steeped in intensity. This was the home of the textualists, the rules archaeologists, the people who believed that AD&D wasn't just a game, it was a manuscript to be understood, contextualized, and properly executed. They turned to the DMG and Player's Handbook with scholarly zeal. What did Gygax really mean? How was this rule used in Lake Geneva? Was this contradiction meaningful or accidental? Discussions on Knights and Knaves sharpened the movement's intellectual edge, and it heavily influenced the old school primers and the later wave of OSR designers who wanted to understand before they reinvented. This was the forge where clarity and philosophy were hammered into shape. And then we have the original D&D discussion forums, the sacred grove of OD&D enthusiasts, also known as OD&D 74. It wasn't about rule precision. It was about spirit. Here, gamers learned and leaned deep into the primordial soup of OD&D. They explored chainmail, minimalist rulings, dungeon as mythic underworld theory, freeform weird fantasy aesthetics. It was a laboratory of imagination, and much of the modern OSR's do-it-yourself DIY vibe, the zines, the rulings overrules ethos, the start light and build up philosophy can be traced directly back to this little corner of the internet. If Knights and Knaves forged doctrine, OD&D 74 nurtured wild inspiration. Now, we're going to pivot a little bit because I'm going to get a few people a little upset with this one. Well, let's talk about ENWorld. It's not an OSR forum. I understand that completely. But it's an important bridge. Okay? Folks forget that Gary himself was an often presence on the forums at ENWorld. It's the place where old school gamers mixed with players from every edition. And that tension, that intermingling mattered because it forced people to articulate why old school play worked and why it mattered, not just that it did. This was the public arena where the OGL's potential became clear, where conversations clashed between design philosophies and the OSR gained unexpected converts. In the grognard pits of ENWorld, the OSR didn't merely defend itself, it explained itself loudly, passionately, and sometimes angrily, but always clearly. This made the OSR visible. It made the OSR real. Put all these forums together, and what you get isn't simply discussion, it's infrastructure. Number one, it's a shared language of play. What do I mean? Player skill, emergent gameplay, rulings over rules, Gygaxian naturalism. That's a tongue twister. These ideas didn't originate in a single place. They crystallized across many. The birth of the Retroclones. Without the forums, OSRIC doesn't happen. Without OSRIC, Labyrinth Lord doesn't happen. Without Labyrinth Lord, Swords and Wizardry doesn't happen. Without those, the OSR as we know it doesn't exist. 3, the foundation of the zine boom. Once people realized they could build games, they started to do it. And the zine era exploded. And last, and I don't think least at all, a culture of conversation. The OSR is a movement of dialogue, disagreement, debate, collaboration. The forums were where that culture was born. Now, my little story. I'm going to go back to Dragonsfoot. This is June of 2014. I'm going to my first North Texas RPG con with my wife, Rach. First con since Gen Con in 93, 94. And we're there Wednesday night before the con kicks off. She wants to use the pool at the hotel, and there's one other person in the pool at the time. And she's looking at him and judging him to be a geek like us, like me. And she is a proud wife, and she's like, "Are you here for the for the convention?" He's like, "Yeah." "Oh, you must know my husband." He goes, "Hmm? Tenkar, Eric Tenkar." He's like, she's like, Tenkar's Tavern. She's getting all frustrated, and he is pulling a blanket. I looked at her, and I said to him, I go, "You don't do blogs, do you? You do forums, right?" He goes, "Yeah." Uh, which one? OD&D 74. Dragonsfoot. He goes, "Oh, I do mostly Dragonsfoot." Rach had no idea. She didn't know these forums existed. I knew they existed. I went to them, but I wasn't a big presence on them because I had my blog. And I had to explain to Rach that they are like parallel, not universes, but they are parallel entities with a similar goal, but the overlap was often kind of small. And that's how it was back then. If you had a blog, you had a minimal presence, usually on forums. And if you were active on forums, you probably didn't have a blog. But I knew about them. I would visit them. Dragonsfoot was great for finding material and just reading threads, but I was more of a lurker back then than an active participant. So that, my friends, is how the early OSR forums didn't just host a community, they helped forge a movement. So, next Sunday, we continue the Chronicles with part 3, Dizzying Explosion and DIY Publishing's Big Bang. That's where these things get beautifully messy, creative, and, most importantly, wonderfully unpredictable. Until then, stay safe, be well, and God bless. And as always, I will see you at the tavern.